Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Fred, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. My name is Fred Van Lente. I'm a writer mostly of comics, fiction comics like Amazing Spider-Man and Marvel Zombies and G.I. Joe and Archer and Armstrong and my own stuff like Weird Detective. Um, However, I do a lot of nonfiction comics as well. So Ryan Dunleavy, the great cartoonist I met in Syracuse University, and our first nonfiction comic was called Action Philosophers. That's a history of philosophers with like fart jokes, told in a hip and humorous comic book fashion. Then we branched out in a book called The Comic Book History of Comics, and we did a series called Action Presidents that you can get right now at your local school or library. That's the presidents, told in a hip and humorous fashion for middle schools. And then at Ryan's urging, we did a book called The Comic Book History of Animation, which I understand is primarily what you want to talk about today.
Now, when you're doing these books, you're kind of learning more about history. You're trying to teach history too. What would your audience range be? Just younger generations or more just anyone that would be interested in maybe not a textbook format?
Well, the President's book is the only one that's explicitly aimed towards children. Everything else is skews adult, I would say, particularly the action philosopher stuff and the comic book history stuff. Um, I think they're truly all ages books. I think anyone from 8 to 80 can read them and enjoy them, but really the President's books are the only one that are explicitly aimed at children.
Now, how'd you get interested in animation, the history of animation?
I'm not particularly interested in animation. However, Ryan Dunleavy is really interested in animation, and doing this book was his idea. And I just found it to be a fascinating story from start to finish. Just researching it, and I do love learning things I don't already know and kind of putting that stuff into a narrative. I like being an explainer, and it's more fun to do that if it's a subject that you're learning along with everybody else as you're explaining it.
Now, what did you learn about the history? Maybe you could take me through the history of animation, like how it first started and how it kind of grew a little bit into necessarily not the form we have now, but just kind of where you really start to peak and flows.
Animation kind of gets its start with movies themselves, right? One of the first innovators of animation is a guy who co-founded the one of the first movie studios, in fact, here in Brooklyn, where I currently live, Vitagraph. Um, and uh, his name, sorry, was J. Stewart Blackton, and he was a British immigrant to the United States. And he started out doing this thing called chalk talking, which was a form of vaudeville routine where somebody would sit there and just draw really quickly, and usually very beautifully. Somebody who was a very famous chalk talker who was both huge in comic strips and animation was the great Winsor McCay, creator of Little Nemo, and also creator of one of the first sort of pieces of character animation called Gertie the Dinosaur. And he lived down the street, believe it or not, from Vitagraph Studios in Blackton, who had already done what we would call stop motion animation. Um, he did the first sort of true animated movie, which is called he directed a movie called Humorous Phases of Funny Faces, which is basically using stop motion animation to do a chalk drawing routine. If you see that movie, it's free on YouTube. It's like, I think maybe 5 minutes long. In fact, you probably can just drop it in over this while we're talking, because it is public domain. You get the idea of what sort of the chalk talking routine was. In fact, Blackton actually used stop motion because he started to try drawing it by hand, and he just realized it was just too labor intensive. So he actually went to stop motion. It's important to keep in mind sort of that all movies are technically animation because they're all just a series of still photographs just sped up and shown really quickly. And for live action movies, you're just taking photos of actors moving around and in cars, and explosions and what else. But sorry, that's what happened to start recording early. Is all. Yeah.
It's all good. But Blackton eventually met Thomas Edison. You go into a little bit about this into your book.
Yeah, Blackton started out as a vaudeville guy. He never really took off, and he ended up working for newspapers. And he got his start in movies when he went to New Jersey to interview Thomas Edison at his factory, which you can still go to today. It's a National Historic Site in Orange, New Jersey. Um, and it was really from Edison that in fact Edison filmed Blackton doing one of his chalk talking routines. It's one of the early Edison silent pictures, silent shorts. Um, and that's really what got Blackton started in on movies. He had to break from Edison because Edison would sue anybody who tried to make movies um, without buying one of his patents or lights. And he was basically trying to own movies as a technology. Part of the reason Hollywood became such an epicenter for the film business was partly because it doesn't rain a lot, so you can shoot outside all the time without worrying about that. But another reason was it was all the way on the other side of the continent from Edison, who was literally suing anybody in New York on the East Coast who was making movies. So he drove. The movie industry used to be centralized in New York, but Edison basically drove all those people west.
You depict him in your book as a squid, which I think it kind of hits the point home when it comes to the number of tentacles he tried to have his hands involved in.
That's right. And squids famously are deaf. They have
Okay,
no
so
sense of hearing.
I did not know that.
Neither did Edison.
um, when it comes to the impact of Edison, I mean, do you consider him, did it just eventually turn into this thing where he's trying to sue everybody, or did it start off good? Like, what progressed him to get to that point? I don't.
I think he felt like he had been burned by the light bulb, where suddenly all these people were manufacturing light bulbs, and he just after that initial invention, he just got super paranoid and just tried to corner the market on everything. And so he made a lot of enemies. Um, and so he's known for sort of starting the movie business, but also he wasn't really a creative. So after making those early movies, particularly Vitagraph in Brooklyn, kind of immediately outpaced. I mean, Vitagraph had like the first movie star. Vitagraph had the first multi, because you were constrained with the length of your movies by how long the film strip was, right? The canister. So you had projectionists. If you've ever gone into a projectionist booth and seen one of these giant projections, projection machines, the projectionists actually have to sit there and tape the different reels together, right, to make one long continuous reel, or you've got to be really quick and swap out the reels. So Edison initially just made these movies that were one reel, but it was Vitagraph who did multi-reelers. It's Vitagraph that did the first Western. Vitagraph had the first sort of movie studio with sets that you could reuse for different movies. So Edison, while he was great as a pioneer in terms of execution and follow through, other people far outpaced him.
Now, Vitagraph, you think that had a bigger importance to the way that we perceive movies, or we kind of the flow of how movies went today, like how we experience them today?
I'd say so. I mean, it was one of the big, it was in the big, half dozen big movie studios. But eventually, California just ended up, taking over. And then the studio system, the Warner Brothers who got their start out in New York, set up their studio, Paramount, all those MGM, all those big studios ended up eclipsing the New York market.
Now, were you surprised that Edison was involved in movies? Did you have any pre-knowledge on that before? Because honestly, that was the first time I really ever heard of it. Maybe it's because I study more of like or look at more of like the 60s and onwards when it comes to Hollywood or something like that. But Disney and all these figures always get mentioned, and like they're the household names that everyone knows, like Pixar, Warner Brothers, all these people know these names and these corporations, and they feel like they've owned the market for forever. But when you find out like someone like the guy who created the light bulb, Thomas Edison, was involved in movies at a point, it kind of takes you off your feet a little bit.
Well, and even you can even go to the Black Mariah, his first movie studio, the first movie studio, right, which was on wheel. It's literally on wheels, right? You can go to New Jersey and see this thing for yourself if you want to. It's on a track, right, on wheels, and so you can push it because even the inventor of the light bulb couldn't generate enough illumination in the late 19th century to get light to get enough light to really shoot a movie. So they had to actually put the movie studio on wheels and wheel it to follow the sun as it went across the sky so they could get maximum light inside the studio. And that's where Blackton, J. Stewart Blackton, was filmed by Edison doing his chalk talking routine, was in that Black Mariah.
Now, who would you consider, out of your research and what you did to make this book, who would you consider an important figure that gets kind of neglected in the conversation when it comes to animation history?
I mean, Edison and Blackton definitely. A lot of people. J.S. Bray is somebody who I think followed the Edison model in the sense that he came up with the idea of a animation table with the holes or the sprockets, or what do you want to call them, the studs that would come out of the table, so you could actually put the paper and fixate it the um on the table, so you could just sit there, because before that, and particularly before cells, right, before the actual invention of using celluloid itself to paint the animation cells on, um before that, somebody like Winsor McKay, people thought he was nuts. He thought he was nuts because he sat there and drew all that stuff, drew it all by hand himself with a couple assistants. So, and that's another reason why he never really got that further into animation once he did Gertie, even though he did a bunch of short films, like there's one about a mosquito, there's one about the Lusitania, just because it was physically, he just found it physically impossible to do. So he stuck to newspaper cartooning and illustration for the rest of his life. Um, I think probably the most unheralded, really important figure is Max Fleischer and his brothers. Max invented the rotoscoping process that allowed you to trace basically live actors performing, and then you could turn live action into animation. I think the primary reason Max gets forgotten is because he basically fought a war with Disney and lost, and history is written by the victors. Even though Fleischer's rotoscoping process was used particularly, most famously, in Snow White. Disney was so desperate to finish Snow White on time, the Snow White herself was actually rotoscoped. A couple of other human non-dwarf characters are rotoscoped as well in Snow White. He's just really interesting because, again, his studio became the biggest animation studio in New York City. It was on Times Square, and they did Betty Boop. Their big hit was when they got Popeye. They got the rights to LZ Cigar's Thimble Theater comic strip, and they came up with the idea that Popeye eats spinach and gets stronger. That was never in the comic strip. It's the Fleischer brothers who came up with that. But they ended up kind of shooting themselves in the foot by being very anti-labor and not reacting well. Not that Disney was particularly pro-labor either, but Fleischer tried to just completely destroy his unions by moving his studio from New York City to Miami, because Florida was much more management friendly. But he lost a lot of his animators, partly because of the distance of Miami in those days was still basically a swamp. It was not, glitz and glamour like we think of it today. The South was super conservative. There was a lot of anti-Semitism down there, and many of his employees were Jewish, and so they left because they couldn't deal with the climate down there. The climate literally was bad for dealing with animation cells because it was so humid, right? And this is before air conditioning was invented. So basic, and then the Fleischer operation really just, what really drove the stake through its heart was the success of Snow White. Once Snow White became the highest grossing film of all time at the time it was released, their distributor Paramount wanted them to do a feature, and just the Fleischers didn't have the staff or really the infrastructure to kind of crank out features. I mean, both their features are not bad. Like Gulliver's Travels isn't bad. I actually think Mr. Bug Goes to Town is super fun, but they just weren't huge hits. And then the war happened, and really, Disney himself barely survived the war himself. And Paramount just shut Fleischer down. They shut Fleischer down right in the middle of when they were producing these Superman cartoons, which are beloved, particularly by Superman and comic book fans. I mean, they all look fantastic today. They're on Max right now. If you get the chance, go and check out those Superman cartoons. There's only about a dozen of them. They all look beautiful. Some of them are super racist. I just want to warn you, but they look gorgeous. And the problem with that is that they were, because they were all rotoscope, they were ridiculously expensive to produce. So Paramount both made Fleischer do the cartoons, but doing the Superman cartoons kind of ran Fleischer into the ground. And Paramount took over the studios and ironically moved them back to Manhattan.
Now, did the animators have power back then? It seemed like they were getting kind of stamped on left and right by all these major studios.
Well, unionization was broken at Fleischer, but it was actually very successful out west, particularly at Disney. Despite, I should point out, Disney's best interest. Disney did its best to crush the unions.
See,
Um,
I don't know that. The last person I had that talked about the labor strike at Disney I mean, he was very apologistic towards Disney. And I appreciate that perspective, but it was like the strike, there was a strike, but Disney didn't really know about the strike. And I
well,
just don't know. I think if you Google
that's
Disney and communism, he was very anti-communist, like much billionaires back then.
he was no, he was absolutely. I mean, they would yell at him as he tried to drive his car into. I mean, they was literally surrounded the studio. There was a vacant lot. Ironically, there was a vacant lot outside on the other side of the street from the Disney studio at the time, and that's where the strikers took up residence. And at least a third, if not half, of his employees went on strike. He knew about the strike. They would yell at him as he tried to drive into the gate. Uh, but and ironically, in that vacant lot where the protests happened was built the hospital where Disney died in 1966 of lung cancer. So that that vacant lot had a lot of
A lot of horrors.
for the Walt Disney himself personally. But no, Walt, people like to say, Walt was anti-Semitic, right? There's no real evidence of that beside him telling a bunch of crude jokes that everybody in those days called. I mean, he certainly made a lot of Jewish people very rich. So the idea that he was anti-Semitic seems a little strange to me. A lot of people, because in the movie Song of the South would say he's an anti-black racist. Again, I would say he just was kind of a typical white Midwesterner of his time. I don't know that he had a special racial animus. However, what he was, as you mentioned earlier, was a rich guy. And a lot of rich guys, their politics and their personal ideology does not really go beyond personal interest, right? So, like Max Fleischer, I should point out, Disney took his employees striking very personally, right? He wanted to think of his employees as a family, you know? And as many of you know, Disney's family life, particularly his upbringing, particularly his relationship with his father, was really bad. So Disney's idea of what a family was a little obscure by his own kind of grim poverty string upbringing. So, so Disney did some nasty stuff. I mean, the nastiest thing Disney did was, as many of you also know, his older brother Roy kind of co-ran the company with him. Roy had much more of a head for business than Disney was. Disney's great skill as a manager, someone who was striking summed it up really well. He said he was great at exploiting other people's genius. Like that was his genius, was locating talented people and getting them to do their best work for him. Disney directed one movie, color film, for a studio. And does anybody know do you know what it is? It's called The Golden Touch. It was an adaptation of the Midas myth. I believe it came in 1940 and was terrible. And so basically his animators were like, "Oh, you're so smart, Walt. You're always criticizing us. You're always stalking the halls." And, some writers would throw up before going to have meetings with him because they're so terrified of him. They're like, "Fine, you make a movie." And he directed it and it was bad. And everybody knew it was bad. And he knew it was bad. As if you really want to get under Disney's skin, mention The Golden Touch because he'd just flip out, right? So the nastiest thing Disney did with the strikers is, so here's the arc of Disney Studios, right? They make Snow White. So, okay, back up. Disney was beloved by the intelligentsia for his shorts and particularly for his silly symphony. So his cartoons were the first ones with sound. So his real smart thing that he did was, after a bunch of false starts, which we talk about in the book, he got ripped off by his distributor and
That's
kind of had,
that's Margaret's husband, right? The one that kind of kicked him
yeah,
out, or
yeah,
so he's got trauma.
yeah. Well, don't we all? uh, so, uh, So yes, Mickey Mouse was a great invention, but what really put Disney on the map was sound. He was the first guy to invest into sound technology. He saw which way Hollywood was going with the talkies and invested heavily in sound technology to the point where he would rent out his sound studios to other people, right? So that was another extra line of revenue from this for the studio, was he was just renting out his equipment as well as making cartoons. The cartoons, keep in mind, were extremely expensive to make, and he was not really turning a huge profit on them. He was winning lots of Oscars. And Max Fleischer used to make fun of Disney. He couldn't stand Disney, and his joke was always, you can't eat Oscars, right? So Disney's real kind of the nastiest thing Disney did was the trajectory of his studio was, the shorts are great, but then what really puts him on the map is Snow White, right? Snow White's a massive, massive success. However, His subsequent films, Bambi and Pinocchio, both bomb. They're financially unsuccessful. Then he has Fantasia, which is another bomb, and requires studio the theaters to have this ridiculously expensive sound system, Fantasta Sound, I think it was called. Um, and so he's in a lot of trouble. What saves Disney is the war, right? When United States enters World War II at the end of 1941, Disney gets all these contracts from the government to make both training films for the military and instructional films for the general public. Like his first is a pro IRS movie, right, starring Donald Duck, that tells people how to do their income tax, because income tax was a relatively new thing back then. So Disney gets Walt Disney Studios classified as a defense contractor, which means if you are a Disney Studios employee, you are exempted from the draft. Okay, you don't have to go fight. You can stay and work in the movie studio, unless you are a union leader, in which case Disney made sure every single one of those union leaders got drafted and sent most frequently to the Pacific. Right, so he literally tried to get. Would you say he tried to get the union leaders killed? Well, not literally. Like, many of them survived. Art Babbitt, famously creator of Goofy, who ended up marrying the model for Snow White, whom Disney absolutely despised and was one of the main union leaders. He survived the war, but he did end up going to the Pacific. So yeah. So the nastiest thing Disney did is that he could have exempted all of his employees from the draft if he wanted to, because he was a defense contractor, but instead he made sure, all the commies, right, got. I mean, his relationship to the union was so bad that Roy had to arrange for the Roosevelt administration for him to go to South America for several months.
Good neighbor policy, right?
Yeah, it was part of the good neighbor policy. But really, the real reason to do that was to get him out of the country, because he didn't want to deal with the union. And Roy realized that this would be the end of the company, right? Because the strikers had gotten the National Labor Relations Board involved, and Roy kind of saw which way, the writing on the wall was, and Walt was just being completely intransigent. And so he was like, well, why don't you leave the country, go to Brazil and go make nice with South America.
Now, Walt wasn't the only first person, or at least wasn't the first person to start working with the military to use some of their cartoons or animation projects, right? Like Bray's also used American, at least cartoons in American propaganda films as well.
Yes, and that was in the previous war. That was World War One. Yeah, that he definitely. And a lot of the guys from UPA, they were all veterans, and Warner Brothers also had their own unit working for the military. So yeah, it was Walt was definitely known. However, Walt Disney Studios during the war, 75% of their output was for the government, right? And then they were also making some movies. Like Dumbo came along right at the same time as Pearl Harbor. Dumbo was a hit. That was their first hit in some time. And then, part of the reason Disney started going in heavily into live action is it was cheaper than animation. Disney's real success was he's the first person to kind of brand family entertainment, right? Like that's really what the Disney name was synonymous with. And then TV comes along, and the Disneyland show comes up on ABC starting in 1950, and then Disney himself hosts it. And well, then that's, he's sort of become next to somebody like Alfred Hitchcock, who also had his own TV show. He's the most famous. He becomes the most famous behind the camera person, I think, in the movie industry. Even though he's kind of like, no one can really define what he does. Like, he runs the studio, but like direct, he doesn't write. He shepherds projects along like a producer, an executive producer was. But his main job was public relations guy. I mean, even Alfred Hitchcock, who had his own TV show, still directed his own movies. And so a lot of people, like somebody like Stan Lee at Marvel, for example, really his perception of himself was very much defined by Walt Disney, and Walt Disney's perception of himself was his kind of avuncular host, right? Uncle Walt is what people call him.
Now, with the Disney brand becoming so massive to where all these animation or these figures that we all know, Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, all these, that, I mean, everyone knows them. Like Mickey Mouse, you could show to any kid or any person, they could tell you who that was. It's kind of like the McDonald's arches. Everyone's just understands what it means. How did they get to that point? I mean, do you consider that just all the good things that they were involved in? Or when I say good things, I mean the amount of things that they were involved in, or good marketing? I mean, it seems like it built up more from this. I mean, it's still got that family type of utopia style, but it to me, it's more of a brand than it is an actual, what Walt wanted it, I guess, to be, which was like this family we're all involved in together, which kind of seems more fantasy.
What really changed, I think, other than the war itself, was television, because um, television both simultaneously wiped out and saved the American animation industry, just because, as many people know, Mickey Mouse, Popeye, Bugs Bunny, all those characters, they were all in shorts, right? 7-minute shorts that you would show along with trailers and a newsreel, and a lot of times there were what were essentially music videos were shown before the main feature. In those days, you treated your local movie theater like a TV channel. You went to your house and sat down and watched the whole time, right? You buy one ticket and get a seat, and you could sit there for hours and hours and hours, and they would just show you more entertainment, right? Like they would just one screen. They would just you would sit there all day and watch it and buy popcorn and do whatever else. But then television comes along, and you don't have to leave your house now, right? And it really devastates the 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 movie industry. And there was also a Supreme Court case which prevented because distributors used to be able to own their own theaters, right? So then the theater owners started owning their own theaters, and then they could say, I don't want newsreels anymore. I don't want cartoon shorts anymore. I want features I can charge higher ticket prices for. So the animation industry, outside of making features, which was really only Disney did that after Fleischer was put out of business. Um, well, they start to sweat it, right? Like, what do we do with our material? However, TV also needs content. It also needs daytime. It needs round the clock content, particularly for kids, particularly on weekends and in mornings. And so then they end up buying from the movie studios all of their shorts, and then those become, Bugs Bunny gets his own show, Popeye gets his own show, and then ABC does a prime time thing with Disney where they're showing. It was called Disneyland, right? The original show. Older folks like me knew it as the Magical World of Disney, right? Which was always on Sunday nights at ABC. And ironically, now Disney owns ABC. But uh, so so Disney, number one, benefited by the fact that it was really Walt never started to make features for adults. Like, he only made his first feature film was also in 1950. It was Treasure Island. He only made stuff for kids and family friendly stuff. His was the only studio really doing that. I think that sort of reflects Walt's own tastes, which were pretty corny. The critics did absolutely turn against him after Snow White because they saw sort of his corniness kind of seep through. Where earlier they found it charming, now it sort of becomes oppressive, right? And you're pro status quo. But I think what really was the global reach was the theme parks, which was something Disney was always interested in. Um, and he lost interest in fantasy. You sort of see the workings of his mind and the what you know people forget that Epcot Center, right, was supposed to start out as a literal planned community, almost like a spaceship on Earth, that where you would go and have good family living. It was kind of trying to be a planned community before
Called
it turned.
Walled Garden.
Yeah, walled garden, great way of putting it. But then it turned into this kind of pro science theme park. But it started out as literally the experiment. What does Epcot stand for? Experimental prototype community of the future, right? Or something like that, of tomorrow. Like, that's what it was supposed to be. It was not a theme park. It was basically a walled community, a gated community. But he never lived to see that happen. And I think his company kind of figured out, well, let's do another theme park. let's not try and control the lives of our consumers.
Has anybody ever had a rivalry when it comes to another studio? I mean, like Warner Brothers, like when it really comes into being as big as Disney? Because if you just talked about, if you ask anybody to name a Hollywood studio, I'm sure people will be able to name you Warner Brothers for sure. But Disney's usually a lot of people's first guess when it comes to something that impacted them.
I mean, for a long time, Disney was its own worst enemy. They came up, they had a rough time after Walt's death, particularly in the 70s, maintaining their brand. Even today, the theme parks, I think, outsell the movies. That's still the most profitable. And they started making investments. The most profitable. I don't think a lot of people would think of what the most profit. I mean, do you know what the most profitable um, content producing arm of the Disney empire is?
I
I
don't, but
mean, you want to guess?
we could try the parks. You mentioned the parks.
No, not the park. The parks are the most profitable overall. I'm talking about just the TV movie end. You know what the most profitable part of that is? It's not Marvel. It's not Lucasfilm. It's not Pixar. It's ESPN is the most profitable.
No shit. What? Wait, hold on.
It's the most profitable part of the Disney empire. Partly because sports are, omnipresent, global, and they're cheap to make. Sports programs, as opposed to you just need to buy the rights and the infrastructure is kind of already there. So yeah, ESPN is by far the most valuable thing Disney owns, but outside of the parks.
It costs no money to make, basically, besides buying all the agreements to be able to use the footage, but it's
Yeah,
live stuff. It's
it's all
just
like yeah,
athletes
it's
playing.
licensing. Yeah, exactly. It's licensing, and it just makes such an ungodly amount of money. Primarily, that just has to do with the nature of sports, um, because they're the only thing men watch. Like if you want to sell stuff to men, sports, men do not watch TV or read or do really much of anything in any significant quantity except consume sports. So that's
Sports
why
and cooking shows that have T-bone steaks on plates.
I guess, but still, I don't know how many of those Disney owns, but yes. So if you want to make money off of 50% of humanity, own a sports network.
When did Pixar come about? Why did Disney feel the need to create Pixar?
Well, don't forget there's a symbiotic relationship with Pixar and Disney all along, right? So Pixar was originally the computer effects department of Lucasfilm, essentially. And then it spun off into its own thing and was spearheaded, as many people know, by Steve Jobs, the Apple guru. But Disney always distributed the Pixar stuff, starting with Toy Story. So really, their acquisition of Pixar was just almost a natural evolution, since they were always in bed with Disney since the very beginning. And Pixar did some animation for, like, there's a bit at the very end of The Little Mermaid that was computer animated. It was hired out to Pixar. So really, it was Disney formally acquiring something that they already kind of held the purse strings for.
What would you consider the biggest cartoon or animation to be?
What do you mean?
Well, when it comes to a certain character, like there's one that you talked about in your book that just kind of seems lost, but has an interesting history to it. And it's Felix the Cat. Like I've seen it before, but I never knew the name of it until honestly looking at your book and when you were explaining the history of it. I was like, oh, I've seen that character multiple times, but I've never really knew its name because I guess I'm just a little bit too young for it.
Well, most people are. It was big in the 20s.
Yeah, yeah.
Big 100 years ago. Yeah, part of the problem with Felix the Cat, I mean, the primary problem with Felix the Cat was that his creator was an alcoholic who died prematurely before securing the copyrights. And so the copyright was just a total mess. So it became in the public domain. So it was never anyone's financial interest to promote Felix the Cat because nobody owned it, right? So it kind of laid a little fallow. Um,
But they had good
but
marketing for Felix the Cat, right? Like that's where you really start to see some interesting strategies take off.
yes, Felix the Cat predates Mickey Mouse and was the first big kind of character, right? That became a big deal in animation. So yeah, that's very true.
And then as it relates to like, let's take a more modern day cartoon animation, something like I wouldn't say Mickey Mouse, I guess is still modern. I mean, it's pretty old, but if you take things like the cartoons that our kids are growing up with now, I mean, they still have Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, and others. But if you really look at like anything that's impactful, like Mickey Mouse compared to the new stuff that's coming out now, there's not a lot of that.
Well, I mean, you really can't downplay the importance of The Simpsons in entertainment history and animation history. It's not it is the most successful primetime cartoon of all time.
It's predicted more things than anybody can count.
Sure. and it spawned an entire industry of adult oriented animation. You know, it's funny, my in-laws, my wife's parents just refused to watch The Simpsons because they just thought, because they're of that generation, the boomer generation, right, where animation's for kids, period. I have no interest in it, right? But then I think they kind of wore them down and now they enjoy it. But yeah, no, I mean, if you want to talk about something that's comparable to Mickey Mouse, I would say The Simpsons, absolutely. You know, and then, you know, you also can't underplay the popularity and just dominance of anime, you know, in Japanese culture in general, which is started basically when I was a kid and is now omnipresent.
Yeah, but like even if we look at like comic books, everyone has an interest no matter the age range, whether they wanted to admit it or not. People like the superhero stuff, and we see that take off even today with the amount of superhero trends that go on now. Everything seems to be like a superhero movie that's created. So there's not really a barrier anymore of like, oh, that's just kids stuff, or this is just strictly adult stuff. It seems like it's all kind of come together.
Sure. I mean, you know, DreamWorks came along obviously and tried to kind of corner that market, and they still have done, you know, Pixar showing some age, right, for the first time in a couple years. Its movies aren't making money. You know, Disney's been struggling recently with its animated movies, while things like Kung Fu Panda and Despicable Me, those properties, you know, are done by non-Disney controlled studios, so that they're successful. So, yeah, it's become a much more diverse market post Pixar, post Simpsons, where animation has become so popular and mainstreamed, everybody's getting involved now, you know.
Was it surprising to you that we're still having this comic book culture that's kind of taken over? It seems like everyone calls himself like a comic book fan. I've seen more people wear Captain America shirts than anything ever before. And it seemed like at a time a lot of people weren't proud of showing that. A lot of people had comic books, but they never really explored that.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I certainly couldn't have predicted it. I mean, I got into the industry like 20 years ago, and certainly the mainstreaming of it's been fascinating to me. I just think that you know, it was essentially like a cache of oil or something, you know, that somebody finally decided to drill, and they just hit pay dirt, you know.
Do you think the movie studios do it justice when it comes to the original comic books?
Not really, but I mean, a lot of those comics are pretty bad, so I'm not gonna sit there and give them a hard time about it. You know, I think that, you know, just someone who worked for Marvel for so long, I just feel like I feel a little sad, frankly, that my generation may very well be the last generation to really have a significant impact on those characters in comics, just because now everyone knows them from, you know, TV and movies, and that's where the energy's gone, right? Is to Hollywood as opposed to the Marvel offices in New York. So it just makes me a little sad, you know, because I kind of grew up in that stuff, right? And it's just been a big part of my life. But on the same token, I'm grateful that I had that experience, you know, before, you know, I was doing the Iron Man kids book um b- before, which premiered before the Robert Downey Jr. movie came out, and they wouldn't let me, and Marvel wouldn't let me see the script or know anything about the movie. So I had to make up all this Iron Man stuff in my kids book because, you know, frankly, because Marvel was afraid the movie would bomb, right? And they didn't want the comic to be too closely tied to this untried movie nobody knew anything about yet. So it's been a very interesting experience
Why were they afraid the movie was gonna bomb?
because they're always afraid, because it was new, because they're always afraid new things are going to
It
bomb. Because
was
quite
such a hit.
well, right, but that's after the fact. Before it comes out, you don't know it's going to be a hit.
Oh my, you have a billionaire that flies around in a giant robot suit. I mean, what's not to love about that?
I mean, you know, if what you say is true, then no movie would ever bomb, right? Because they wouldn't make them in the first place.
I think the inspiration for was it Howard Stark is the inspiration to that was Howard Hughes, wasn't it?
Sure.
Billionaire playboy. I wouldn't say philanthropist type, but definitely billionaire playboy with the mustache and everything. That sleek look. But how did you get started in Marvel Studios?
Well, I never worked for Marvel Studios, just Marvel Comics. I basically met a bunch of guys who were learning to be artists and illustrators at the comic book club at Syracuse University. I ended up writing for them. And Ryan Dunleavy, who I did the comic book history of animation with, I met him at Syracuse. And I just ended up doing independent comics that got Marvel interested, and they offered me to pitch, and I did, and the rest is history. You know, it's just I started doing it on my own, and then Marvel was like, "Hey, we like what you do," or one editor at Marvel said that, and I was off to the races. You know.
Now, were you ever a part of that fandom that went to Marvel or DC and chose a side? Or did you just enjoy it all?
Not really. I mean, I grew up more as a Marvel guy, more on Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and the Hulk. I've never really worked for DC, but that's just DC's problem. I don't quite know why they don't like me, but it's something I've lived with. All right, but no, I don't. Every once in a while, you meet somebody who's really like anti one or the other. And I just find that childish. Who cares? You
Can I ask what your thought is on the Snyderverse?
know? I have only seen, I guess that's not true. I guess I've seen Batman v Superman and Justice League. They're not my thing. They're a little too self-important.
Do you
I'm not, not a,
do you believe, like, even when you're writing with comics, that there are these kind of sacred cows that come with a certain superhero? Like, nobody wants to see Superman kill anybody, and Batman doesn't kill people, but sometimes I like to see it when those are gods or, metaphorical gods are put in these positions where they have to make a tough decision like that. I think it's different and it's kind of new.
yeah. Well, they're made up characters. They're open to multiple interpretations. I wouldn't, you know, I can't really sit through Man of Steel because I think it's boring. Not because I
Really?
find.
Wow.
Oh yeah, no, I've tried watching on cable multiple times. Like I can't get into this. I'm not the huge just a Superman fan to begin with, but yeah, no, I don't. There's no such thing as a sacred cow. They're all open to interpretation. Just do a good job, right? There's just good execution and bad execution, not sacred cows. And I just think most of the Snyder movies are badly executed. Um, the Snyder cut is just long and has more slow motion and than the Josh Whedon version.
I always just thought they put a filter effect on it to make everything look darker, and they called it the Snyder Cut.
I mean, you'd have to ask him, man.
Who's your favorite superhero?
Well, kid, it was a kid Spider-Man, I think definitely. I was a real kick when I got to write his comic, and I did it. And but then I did it like I did a lot of Spider-Man for like a year and a half, and then I never want to do it again. I just got burnt out by it.
Why
Like,
Spider-Man?
because he's a nerd. He's a wise ass nerd like me. I mean, it's not rocket science,
I don't
you
think you're a
know.
wise ass.
Well, trust me, this interview went longer. But yeah, that's pretty much why I think. I love Ditko's art. Like I got the Steve Ditko stuff in reprint in the 70s, and I just really liked his art. I know most people prefer John Romita Sr., but and I like John Romita Sr. too, but just a super fun character.
As you've worked in the industry, can you maybe share with me your perspective on what might have changed from when you were a kid looking at just the whole comic book culture in general? I mean, even with the fandoms, I've grown a fascination for the fandoms, at least how deep people can really analyze certain comic book features or certain details and get into either the comic arts form, or talk about hidden philosophies within comics. I've had a few people on to discuss that. I always found it interesting because I think a lot of people just look at a comic and they see their favorite character and then flip through the pages and never think a second more.
There's a lot of that. I think people just like what they like and they kind of gravitate towards it, just doing comic shows and going to signings and stuff. I mean, some people just respond to Deadpool or Archer and Armstrong or G.I. Joe or any one of a number of franchises, and that's sort of how they kind of fix it. I mean, some people get a little crazy. I'd worked on Spider-Man when they had undone his marriage to Mary Jane, which many people freaked the heck out about for some reason. That was important to them. So that's probably the most irrational fan thing I was ever directly involved in, to the point where we were getting like death threats and stuff, as people got unhinged. Um, but I think it's all just kind of the same. I mean, I just feel like it's the more things change, the more they stay the same. I don't think it's really that much different. Doing the history of comics book, you just look at old fanzines from like the 60s from when my dad was a kid or something. And it's kind of the same thing. It's just online now instead of, typed up and mimeographed and sent through the mail.
Now, could you, I mean, this is off the animation stuff, but when we talk about Stan Lee's impact on comics,
Uh-huh.
did he take other people's work kind of like Walt Disney did a little bit?
Well, don't forget. I mean, Stanley was very much influenced by Disney, and I think that's sort of the model he had. He was also somebody who was a genius at exploiting other people's genius. The difference is that Stan Lee's family owned Marvel, right? So that's how he got the job there in the first place. So like Walt Disney, it's hard to, it's hard to give a lot of credit to somebody like Stan, simply because he was not just a creative type, he was also the boss, right? So it was, it's the golden rule: whoever owns the gold makes the rules, right? So Stan had the gold, he made the rules. So like Walt, he kind of projected this kind of avuncular, um happy-go-lucky personality. And I think, unlike Walt, now I haven't met a lot of people who actually work directly for Walt Disney. um I have met a lot of people who work directly for Stan Lee, who, for the most part, just praise him and, say wonderful things about him. And great. I never met the man. I was in an elevator with him once. That was the closest I got to him. Uh, but yeah, no, one of the things that really put Marvel on the map in the early 60s, when Amazing Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and X-Men and all that stuff were originally coming out, was that you had the singular editorial voice going through all the comics, right? That was Stan's voice, to the point where, when Stan left sort of the editorial side of the comics and went to Hollywood, where he, let's be frank, didn't really do much, they were so worried about his lack of presence. Every single Marvel comic had Stan Lee Presents on it, right? Stamped on there for years and years and years, decades. So people would know his presence was still there. Sort of like how, it wasn't called Stan Lee Comics, but just as the way Walt Disney Studios was Walt Disney Studios, but they made sure there. So it was in the corporate interest of Marvel to promote Stan as sort of the main creator of all the stuff, and he certainly never significantly stopped anybody from doing it. He was kind of a passive guy in that sense, and to the point where, if you're like me and you're my age and you grew up reading things like The Origin of Marvel Comics by Stan Lee, and you learn that a lot of those stories are kind of bullshit, kind of corporate propaganda, essentially, you get upset and you kind of turn against the guy. As I get older, as I've done a lot of work, with the work and lives of people like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, who were Lee's primary collaborators, I've tempered it somewhat. You've Jack Kirby fans who think the only response to Stan Lee is to dig him up and beat him with sticks. That's not really my kind of thing. I'm very much a pro Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko guy, but not necessarily thinking of Stan Lee as Satan. I just think he was a guy, unlike Disney. So the difference between Walt Disney and Stan Lee is that Disney was really had the entrepreneurial spark, right? He was a real visionary business guy. Stan just kind of stumbled into the Marvel Comics thing in his 40s and just kind of wrote it the rest of his life. While Disney, from the time he was a very young man, was very driven. And Disney legitimately improved the movie industry through things like color and sound in his cartoons. Like, he did not make a dime for the first 20 years of the studio's existence because he sunk all that money back into the movies. Lee ended up kind of shucksing his way through life and kind of was more of an opportunist who kind of stumbled into success by accident. Disney kind of went out and was very driven to success from the very beginning.
But even like with Stan Lee, would we have a bigger, I mean, at least a deeper love for comics if it wasn't just a central figure that it seemed like created all these? Like Stan Lee's, everyone knows the name. It's like a household name. But if you're actually into comics and you know Jack Kirby, you know all these other people, those people should be getting more credit. But I feel like if you have a bunch of individual creators compared to just one central figure like Stan Lee, I mean, would we still have the love that we have for comics when it comes to that?
Sure. I mean, most people know. I mean, okay, if you read comics, Stan Lee didn't draw anything, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the fact that comics exist,
Didn't he write the words for it and then the artist had to figure out to make the scenes or something based on the words that were written there?
no, the other way around. The artist brought in the art, and then he wrote the dialogue underneath it. So the story was already there in the pictures, right? It's just he added the dialogue. And sometimes he would give a little more direction. That sometimes he didn't give any direction at all. In fact, very often he never gave any direction at all. So the idea of calling him a writer is, to someone like me who does write and who does tell the artist what to do beforehand, I'm a little annoyed by that. The artists were annoyed because, don't forget, um, Stanley got paid for writing, right? He wasn't just the editor. He wasn't just an employee. He got paid a page rate for the scripts that he was doing, when in fact the artists were unpaid writers doing a lot of that plotting themselves. So, in that sense, yeah, it's a little underhanded, a little hinky. Not great, not great, Bob. Kind of like Disney sending labor leaders off to be killed by the Japanese. Not
No,
great.
wait, what?
Yes, do you remember
Wait,
earlier when it came out how
I didn't know they were getting killed.
they're in the army fighting the
Oh
Japanese?
shit! I thought you meant like they're sending them to like a torture camp or something. I
What
was
do you
like,
what do
wait,
you
he's
think? They're just
directly
hanging
sending.
out,
No, I
eating
didn't.
sushi,
Oh,
you know?
good God!
Not great.
Oh
So
my
yeah,
God!
but that's not all they were. Um, but it's something to take into consideration, particularly if you've, as you describe them, folks on who are apologists. I'm neither an apologist nor somebody who's gonna like, I'm not a prosecutor either. I'm just trying to tell you the facts.
Yeah. Well, why do you think people neglect the facts? Like I always thought this was strange that like you had a bunch of people that were just obsessed with Disneyland, like the park in general. Like they're adults that seem like I'm like, are you guys on drugs? Like what's going on here? Like we're adults, you can go there for a weekend, it's fun and all that, but there's like a real neglect of actually like when you're looking at the history, there's a little bit of dark stuff with Disney, but none of them ever talk about it. And I always wondered, like, why would you ignore it if it's just historical stuff? It's not like you're trying to spit on anybody because they're gone. It's just because you're looking at the historical record. You want to give accurate information.
Well, I think life can be very chaotic and confusing and upsetting. And I think many people want to live in a cartoon where good and evil, good and bad are all kind of clearly spelled out. And you don't have to stress out trying to figure out this stuff out. And I think some people, you know, want to believe. I mean, I have people in my family who are like this, people who want to believe that, Disney is the safe place where everything is good and wonderful and it reminds me of being a kid again. And just leave it alone and just make it be this sort of safe space where I don't have to think about, things that might be controversial. And I get that. That's part of human nature. I just don't subscribe to it myself. And I know plenty of people, just I was talking about before, who get very upset, particularly people who worked for Marvel or worked for one of Stanley's other companies after he left Marvel, who had a personal relationship with Stan, and that personal relationship was very good. And find all the Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko stuff overblown, or they think that by saying, Stan didn't really write all that stuff. You realize that, right? They get very mad because they think because one of the things people like Stan Lee and to a lesser extent Walt Disney are good at or for the people that are lucky enough to be their friends, they have that kind of warm relationship, right? No, very rarely do you have someone in life who's an asshole to everybody, right? Every asshole has two or three people or their dog who likes them. They're just mean to everybody else.
What would you consider a peak point for animation?
Well, I mean, I would say that to a certain extent we're in it still right now. I mean, you did have a point where The Simpsons was coming out, you had Pixar making great movies, you had Disney making great movies. I mean, the 90s seemed like a good place if you want to point to a big, you had the Batman the Animated Series coming out after the Tim Burton Batman movie. That was a huge watermark for animation, and
I
it
just downloaded the trial for Hanna-Barbera for Amazon Prime. They have it where it's like 7 days or something like that. I was trying to introduce my nephews to some of the old cartoons and stuff like that. Stuff that was like I was not even really old enough for, but just we're watching it together and they were like, "Can we watch Pokemon?" I was like, "That's captured you, hasn't it?" It got me too for a good bit, but I still like watching the older retro stuff, the stuff on Hanna-Barbera and then also Boomerang. Boomerang was another one too.
Yep, I subscribed to Boomerang while I was writing the comics history or the animation history. Yeah, 90s you also have Pokemon. You have the late 90s you have the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right at the beginning of the decade. So I think the 1990s are pretty good because you had great stuff happening both on TV and in animation. I mean, Miyazaki started making his big release popular features in the 90s. Even though he'd done Nazca in the 80s and some of his 80s stuff is fantastic. Princess Mononoke and all that stuff came out in the 90s. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good globally. The 90s were pretty hard to beat.
Now, when it comes to animation and when they added sound on there, how much did dubbing change when people started adding voices and things to really give these characters an actual lifelikeness to them?
Uh, well, I mean, obviously that was happening not just in animation, also in live action. It just revolutionized the whole thing. You were able to. I think there were feature silent films, but I think it was just easier for people to relate to people who could talk, right? It just increased audience interaction.
Now, when you're writing these books and I mean, you got a massive amount of work out there. What was one of your favorites? I mean, did you like the more nonfiction stuff a little bit more, or did you like diving into just being able to create, obviously like doing comics and stuff like that, but
Well, I mean, for when you're a working writer and when you're, when you're doing the stuff, the next thing's always the most exciting. You know, I don't, you don't spend a lot of time, sitting around sniffing your own farts, right? You're always headed, you're always looking at the future. So for me, the best thing I've done, I haven't done yet.
yeah, but you're a researcher, so you obviously enjoy looking at finding information and being able to write it down, but how do you choose what topic you're going to write about next?
Oh, well, these projects take a long time to do. So to a certain extent, I've kind of retired I actually have a book kickstarting next month called Game Masters. It's the comic book history of role-playing games that I'm doing with Tom Fowler. That's going to be very exciting. That, however, I wrote in 2019. So as you can tell, I do a lot of geek stuff, which is kind of interesting, like animation and role-playing game stuff. I love American history. So to a certain extent, I kind of run out of topics that I'm kind of interested in. Like we've been doing action philosophers since 2003, so it's been over 20 years at this point. And frankly, there's no more money in lying, so I'm focused more of my efforts on fiction because the nonfiction stuff is fun, but I think it's when we were doing action philosophers, nonfiction comics were kind of a novelty. Now they're very much the mainstream. So Ryan and I aren't as special anymore.
Why do you think it's the mainstream now?
I think people realize it's a great way to convey the information. I mean, even there's been educational studies that show that comics, much more than just straight up text prose books, um, allow people to retain information more easily, and that makes sense when you think about if you think about your internal monologue. It's not words, right? It's a combination of words and pictures. Words and pictures are how we think, so it makes sense that it's easier to foster thought and learning through comics than it is just through straight words, or for that matter, straight pictures. I don't know how you would do that, but
I don't know if you remember this comic brand, but it's Graphics Universe. You ever heard of them before? They did a lot of weird
maybe.
mythology comics, like about Aztecs and the Greeks and the Hercules, and they had all these types. It really
Cool.
inspired me to have an interest in certain areas when it came to ancient Greece and stuff like that. Did you have any
I
inspirations
believe
for
it.
you besides Marvel or any
Sure.
superhero stuff?
Oh yeah, well the nonfiction stuff. There's a great writer artist, one of the first underground cartoonists went by the pen name of Jackson. He did a lot of books like Comanche Moon and Los Tejanos. He was a Texas historian, so he told stories about Texas history through comics, and it was very irreverent, fun to read. He was a huge influence on me, as was Larry Gonick, who did a series called Cartoon History of Blank, like the universe in America and all this stuff. So he actually came up to us at our table once in New York Comic Con, said how much you liked your comics. That was pretty cool.
You've given me enough of your time, Fred. I appreciate the time talking on my show. I know we kind of covered a wide range of subjects here. But is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Yeah, I'm at Fred Van Lente. It's just my name, right? So it's fredvanlente.com. I'm Fred Van Lente on X and Blue Sky and Instagram and blah blah blah. And yeah, so you can sign up for my newsletter, which I never put out, so you won't be flooded with spam or anything. But yeah, just check out all those places on my name. If you can spell my name, you can find me on the internet anywhere.
Awesome. And I'll make sure any links I find, I'll link in the description of this video. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.